Officials in Pakistan say a foiled militant attack on a paramilitary security headquarters in the northwestern city of Peshawar has killed several troops and wounded others. Police say a suicide bomber blew himself up at the entrance of the compound, and 2 other attackers were shot dead. There are also reports of civilian casualties. The security forces have cordoned off the area. No group has yet admitted responsibility for the attack. The meeting of leaders from the world's top economies, the G20 summit, concluded on Sunday in Johannesburg, South Africa. Dozens of protesters gathered outside the venue calling for action on issues including debt relief and migration, while inside talks were overshadowed by European leaders scrambling to respond to President Trump's Ukraine-Russia peace plan.
Together, we must accelerate progress towards the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations and the Pact for the Future. We have laid the foundation of solidarity. Now we must build the walls of justice and the roof of prosperity. Let us move forward together, demonstrating to the world that we do have the capacity to confront and overcome the world's challenges. I now say that this gavel of this G20 summit formally closes this summit and now moves on to the next president of the G20, which is the United States, where we shall see each other again next year. The summit is therefore closed.
President Ramaphosa. Now, after weeks of discussion and all-night haggling, delegates at the COP30 climate conference in Brazil have finally agreed on a draft deal. It includes steps to review trade barriers and triple financial aid to developing countries impacted by extreme weather events. But there's been no mention of phasing out the largest emitter, fossil fuels, much to the disappointment of many countries in Latin America, Europe, the Caribbean, and parts of Africa.
I therefore invite the CMA to adopt the following draft decisions. Global Mutirão, uniting humanity in a global mobilization against climate change, contained in document CMA/2025/L.24. Please note that the L document refers to CMA 6 instead of CMA 7. It will be corrected by the Secretariat. United Arab Emirates Just Transition Work Program, contained in document CMA/2025/L.14.
Well, Professor Chukwumerije Okereke is one of Nigeria's foremost international climatologists. He's a UN scientist and globally recognized scholar on environmental policy and climate change. He's been at the climate summit from the very start, and he joins me now on the line from the UK. Thank you very much indeed, Prof, for joining us. So after all-night haggling, the proceedings have come to a close and they finally agreed a deal that's supposed to help climate change, but lots of disappointment that they failed to get the words fossil fuels into the agreement. Given that, what are your reflections on the COP30 climate summit?
Charles, I think the glass is half full or half empty, depending on your philosophical position. This COP was always going to be very, very difficult given the wider geopolitical situation. ongoing war in Ukraine, United States position on climate change, and very tense relationship in other parts of the world. So, in the context of all of those, some people argue that although the nations were unable to insert a clear roadmap for fossil fuel phase out, that this COP remained nonetheless a success. However, if you look at the fact that the emissions continue to rise rapidly and that nearly a quarter of the countries have not still submitted their NDCs, and we're talking about countries like Saudi Arabia and India, and also given the fact that there is no clear roadmap on how to phase out fossil fuel, you can understand why so many people think that this has been a disaster.
And so, Professor, what would you consider to be the good bits of that deal? I mean, let's start with that. I understand the deal reinforces the importance of the Paris Climate Agreement, and they agreed that efforts to help the fight against climate change must continue.
One of the best parts of the agreement, if you like, is the fact that the countries have managed to still hold on to the concept of multilateralism, which was quite frankly at the risk of complete disintegration, given the fact that the United States wasn't going to come, China wasn't going to come, and India, many other big countries were going to stay away. So at a point, it really felt that there was no point of this summit. But out of that, if you like, seeming ashes, has arisen this 8-page document that reemphasizes that climate change is the common concern for mankind, that, it is the right of individuals to have clean air, that indigenous communities need to, be included in plans to solve climate change. But also, there has been some commitment to raise more money for developing countries and to reassert climate justice as a center of negotiation. Some of the things which I think African countries and indeed a lot of other developing countries welcome. But the fact that there is still no clear amount of money on the table or a clear roadmap on how to phase down fossil fuel, many people will, be shaking their heads like, what are we doing? Because the numbers in terms of the GHG emissions continues to rise to alarming levels.
And in that regard, they agreed that efforts to keep the rise in global temperatures under 1.5 C must continue, even though, as I'm sure you know, the world is certain to overshoot that climate threshold within a few years.
Indeed, I think for a very long time it was a hush 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 in the room. We weren't allowed to, as scientists, even admit that I think we're going to definitely overshoot. Eventually, we had to agree, everybody had to agree that, if you look at the numbers, there's absolutely no way that we will not overshoot. So the language quickly changed to that we must return to a credible path to achieving 1.5, even if there was to be an overshoot, and that overshoot has to be very limited. I worry because, in a sense, we've already been locked in to dangerous, patterns of warming, and some of the latest numbers are suggesting up to 2.5 degrees increase in global mean temperature by 2100, and that will be catastrophic for countries such as Nigeria.
Well, you talk about Nigeria there, just looking at the downside that you touched on earlier. I mean, it's your sense, obviously, that this deal was a missed opportunity for greater progress on phasing out fossil fuels. But I understand there was a lot of opposition from major fossil producers such as Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Nigeria, which happens to be your country and mine.
That is exactly what happened. But again, Charles, one of the things that I think I regret was that some of the countries didn't take some of our advice. Our advice was that we should, limit this idea of emphasizing on a roadmap for a phase out and gather the countries that have already made some commitment to phase down or phase out and reinforce those commitments. And Congress of Nigeria, in their DDP, their LTS, their NDC, and in fact their Climate Act, have already committed to some kind of phase down or phase out. And so rather than haggling on a collective roadmap by all the countries, we were advising some of the countries to just consolidate on the existing pledges that have already been made. Because if you do that, countries like Nigeria would already be saying, well, in a sense, they are already committed to a phase out. So there's a lot of countries that were speaking from both sides of their mouth. On paper, they have committed to some level of phase out, but in the negotiation, and including Nigeria to some extent, they were really opposing. And this was a very confusing signal for people like me.
So very briefly, because we're almost out of time, breaking down the good and the bad of what's been described as a very complex COP. What is your overall assessment of this COP30 summit?
Well, the good, I think, still outweighs the bad because of the tortuous geopolitical landscape we find ourselves. We managed to see the COP to a successful end. A fire outbreak was averted. We now have the facility, the forest facility, a greater emphasis on climate justice, the commitment to keep the 1.5 alive, and potentially more money for adaptation. But failing to have a solid point on fossil fuel phase out and not being clear about where the money is going to come from remains important downsides.
Prof, thank you very much indeed for that assessment. Professor Chukwumerije Okereke is one of Nigeria's foremost international climatologists. He's a UN scientist and he's a globally recognized scholar on environmental policy and climate change. And he was talking to me on the line there from the UK.